The morning after Madeleine Astor died, the New York Times ran a single headline: Mrs. Fairmont dead in Florida. Not Madeleine Astor. Not the widow of John Jacob Astor Roman IV, the richest man aboard the Titanic, the richest man on that ship the night it sank. Not the 19-year-old who was pulled from the North Atlantic 5 months pregnant, who gave birth 4 months after her husband's body was recovered from the ocean. Not the woman who survived the Titanic and then spent 28 years fighting, legally, financially, personally, for the right to simply be alive on her own terms. Mrs. Fairmont. The name of a man she had divorced 2 years before she died. That headline is still in the archive. Anyone can find it. And here is what it tells you, if you know what you're looking at. Someone spent decades deciding what Madeleine Astor was allowed to be called. A will, a family, a city's social order. They very nearly succeeded in reducing her to a footnote. A name. Someone else's name. This is the trace that survived. Follow it backward, and it leads to something that was supposed to stay buried. The buried thing does not begin on the Titanic. It begins 2 years before the ship ever sailed, in a New York City courtroom and a lawyer's office where a divorce was finalized. Colonel John Jacob Astor Roman IV, heir to one of the great American fortunes, builder of the Waldorf Astoria and the St. Regis, real estate developer and amateur inventor whose net worth in 1912 would amount to approximately $2.9 billion in today's money, Colonel Astor had ended his first marriage in November 1909. His first wife was Ava Lowell Willing. Their marriage had reportedly been unhappy for years. The divorce was messy in the way that Gilded Age divorces among the very wealthy were always messy, intensely public, laden with implication, and processed by a social order that had very particular views about who was entitled to move on afterward. The answer, in 1909 New York, was not really anyone, but especially not a man of Astor's prominence. And especially not if he intended to do what he announced almost immediately: remarry. When John Jacob Astor Roman IV became engaged to Madeleine Force in August 1911, she was 18, he was 47, and his son Vincent was 1 year older than his intended bride. New York society did not simply disapprove. It mobilized. The 400, the rarefied social tier that Astor's own mother Caroline had spent decades constructing and controlling, closed ranks against the match with a completeness that must have been dizzying to a young woman who had, weeks earlier, simply been a well-bred girl from Brooklyn. They struggled to find a minister willing to perform the ceremony. Astor's divorce made remarriage scandalous enough to close most church doors. Eventually, a clergyman was found. The wedding proceeded on September 9, 1911, in the ballroom at Beechwood, the family's Newport mansion. Vincent Astor served as best man, not from warmth, but from duty. He despised Madeleine from that day and made no particular effort to hide it. The newspapers that covered the wedding were not kind. Editorial cartoons. Society columns that treated the age difference as a civic offense. Reports that Madeleine had fallen gravely ill shortly after the engagement announcement, described by contemporary accounts as a severe physical and nervous collapse brought on by the relentless pressure of the coverage. She recovered. The coverage did not soften. This is the first layer of the burial. Madeleine Force was not recognized as Madeleine Astor even after she legally became Madeleine Astor. The institution of New York society, which the Astor family had helped create, refused to ratify her existence as a member of that family. She was received nowhere. She was invited to nothing. The women who had previously fawned over the Astor name looked through her as though she were glass. And so they fled. Egypt, Paris, the Nile in January, the pyramids. Margaret Brown, one of the very few prominent Americans who continued to receive the Astors without ostracism, traveled with them through Egypt. The plan was simple: wait overseas until the gossip lost interest. Until New York decided it had something else to consume. The gossip did not lose interest. But Madeleine became pregnant, and that changed the calculation. She wanted the child born in America. They needed to return. They chose the Titanic, the newest, largest, most celebrated ship in the world. Maiden voyage. First class. Suite on sea deck. Madeleine's maid, Rosalie Bidwell. Her private nurse, Caroline Andres. Colonel Astor's valet, Victor Robbins. And Kitty, the colonel's Airedale Terrier, who had once gone missing in Egypt and whom they had been fortunate enough to recover. This is what was being buried, even before departure, Madeleine's legitimacy as a person within the world that bore her husband's name. Before the Titanic sailed, before the iceberg, before any of what was coming, a legal document had already been signed that would govern the rest of her life. Colonel Astor had written his will. It had been executed and witnessed. It was sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting. The will is a document of calibrated precision. An estate of approximately $85 million. His son Vincent, whom he had fathered during his first marriage, who despised his stepmother, who was serving as best man out of obligation, Vincent received $69 million. The Ferncliff estate in Rhinebeck. The yacht. The bulk of the fortune, overwhelming in its magnitude. His daughter Ava, also from the first marriage, received a $10 million trust fund. And Madeleine, his wife, 7 months his wife at the time the will was executed, the mother of his unborn child, Madeleine received the income from a $5 million trust fund and $100,000 outright. She was given the use of 2 mansions, 845th Avenue in Manhattan and Beechwood in Newport, furnished and maintained. 5 horses. 1 luxury car of her choosing, provided that she did not remarry. 3 words. Buried in the provisions of a legal document. If she remarried, for any reason, to any person, at any time in the remainder of her life, the trust income stopped. The Fifth Avenue mansion reverted. Beechwood was no longer hers. Everything conditional vanished the moment she attempted to live as a person rather than as a widow. The only thing that could not be taken from her was the $100,000 outright. Everything else was contingent on her remaining, legally and publicly, the widow of a dead man. Her unborn child was not even named in the will. There was a provision, cold and generic, for any surviving child not already listed. A $3 million trust, held until the age of 21. Not, my son or my daughter or this child. A legal category. A placeholder for a human being who had not yet been born. The will was signed before the Titanic sailed. It would not become operative until after the ship sank. But it was already there, already written, already encoding what Colonel Astor believed his wife's life was worth and under what conditions she was permitted to have one. The buried thing is simple once you see it clearly. Madeleine Astor was never fully owned by her own name. Not by New York society, which refused her. Not by the Astor family, which tolerated her at best. Not by the will, which held her inheritance hostage to her romantic choices for the rest of her natural life. She survived the Titanic. And then she had to survive what came after. On the night of April 14, 1912, at approximately 11:40 p.m. the Titanic struck an iceberg at full speed in the North Atlantic. Madeleine had retired to their suite. Colonel Astor woke and went to find Captain Smith. When he returned, his expression told her more than his words. He said the ship had struck ice. He said the damage did not appear serious. But he cut open a spare life jacket with a penknife and showed her what was inside. He helped her strap on her own. Whatever he said about the damage, he was already preparing her. They went to the boat deck. They waited. At some point they retired to the first-class gymnasium and sat together on the mechanical horses, wearing their life jackets. This detail, recorded by witnesses and entered into the historical account, has a particular quality to it. 2 people, side by side in life jackets, on mechanical horses in a gymnasium on a sinking ship. As if motion could substitute for the fact that there was nowhere to go. When the order came to board the lifeboats, Madeleine and her maid and her nurse had to crawl through a first-class promenade window. The lifeboat had been lowered to A deck, and climb into lifeboat 4. Colonel Astor helped her through the window. Then he asked Second Officer Charles Lideler whether he might accompany his wife, given her condition. Lideler said no. Colonel Astor did not press the issue. He stepped back. He is reported to have asked for the number of the lifeboat, number 4, so that he would know which one to look for his wife in, as if he expected there would be a harbor, an accounting of which boat carried whom. Lifeboat 4 was lowered at 1:55 a.m. The ship sank at 2:20 a.m. Madeleine later said, through her spokesman Nicholas Biddle, a trustee of the Astor estate, because she was too fragile to speak to the press herself, that she thought she last saw the colonel standing by her side in the confusion as she was about to be put in the boat. After that, she had no clear recollection until the boats were well away from the ship. She thought there had been room in her boat for 15 more people. She did not understand why the men had not seemed anxious to leave. That statement, she did not understand why the men had not seemed anxious to leave, is in the historical record. It was captured in contemporaneous press coverage and entered the official account. It was the observation of someone who had just watched a ship disappear from a lifeboat and was trying to make sense of something that did not make sense. It was never answered. The Carpathia reached the survivors around 3:30 a.m. Madeleine reached New York on April 18, arriving at Pier 54 in a state that contemporary accounts described as dazed by shock and in a nervous collapse. Her doctors ordered strict bed rest. They instructed her not to speak about the sinking, fearing it would worsen her condition. She had, as one account put it, badly shattered nerves and spent much of her waking hours weeping. When she arrived, she still hoped he had been found somewhere, somehow. She told her father, "I hope he is alive somewhere." On April 22, Colonel Astor's body was recovered from the Atlantic by the cable ship Mackay Bennett. He was identified by the initials sewn into the collar of his jacket. He was carrying more than $2,500 in cash, a gold pocket watch, a diamond ring, and diamond cufflinks. Vincent Astor claimed the gold watch and wore it for the rest of his life. Madeleine was 19 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. She was the widow of the richest man who had been on the ship, and the burial, which had begun with the wool and the social exclusion, was now fully operational. Vincent Astor was 20 years old when his father died. Overnight he became what the newspapers called the richest boy in America, inheriting $69 million and with it the Astor name's social authority. He had despised Madeleine from before the wedding. Now he held the estate's largest share, controlled the family's institutional power, and had no legal obligation to extend to his stepmother anything beyond what the will mandated. The will mandated very little. It mandated the conditional trust, conditional on her not remarrying. It mandated the use of the mansions, same condition. It mandated the $100,000 outright, which was not conditioned on anything. And here is where the burial becomes visible in its full architecture. Madeleine was kept in strict retirement. She did not appear publicly until the end of May, when she hosted a luncheon at the Fifth Avenue mansion for the captain and surgeon of the Carpathia, the men who had pulled her and 704 other survivors from the Atlantic. She held the event together with Marion Thayer, another Titanic widow, another woman trying to behave correctly under extraordinary pressure. On August 14, 1912, exactly 4 months and 2 days after the ship sank, Madeleine gave birth to a son at the Fifth Avenue mansion. She named him John Jacob Astor. He would eventually be known to the world as the Titanic baby. The child now existed. The legal category in the will had a name, a face, a heartbeat that had been there on the ship, undetected, 5 months along when Lifeboat 4 was lowered. His trust fund, $3 million, held until age 21. By the time he reached 21, it had grown to $5 million. Vincent's inheritance, $69 million. These numbers are not in dispute. They are in the will. They are in the public record. They are the burial made visible in dollar amounts. What Vincent controlled, by virtue of inheriting the bulk of the estate, was something less tangible but more powerful than money. He controlled the definition of who was an Astor. And his answer, conveyed in every interaction with Madeleine and her son across the following decades, was clear. Madeleine was not one. Her son was barely one. The Astor name belonged to Vincent, its legitimate heir, its trustee and steward. The woman his father had married at 47, the young woman from Brooklyn who had crawled through a ship's window into a lifeboat while pregnant. She was a complication the family had been saddled with, not a member of it. The mechanism of burial was therefore threefold. Legal, the conditional will that held Madeleine's income and homes hostage to her marital status. Financial, the staggering disparity between what Vincent received and what Madeleine received, encoding in hard numbers the family's assessment of her worth. And social, the continued exclusion, the city's refusal to fully receive her, the weight of an institution that had decided before the Titanic sailed that she did not quite belong. Madeleine spent 4 years in the Fifth Avenue mansion and at Beechwood, raising her son inside the terms of a document she had not written. She slowly re-emerged. She appeared at Belmont Park in 1915, photographed by the press. She began accepting invitations again. And then, in 1916, she made the decision the will had been designed to preempt. She married William Carl Dick, a banker, a childhood acquaintance, a respectable and quiet man from a family whose fortune had been made in sugar refining. She was 23 years old. The moment she did, the will's clause activated with mechanical precision. The trust income ceased. The Fifth Avenue mansion was no longer hers. Beechwood was no longer hers. She forfeited everything the conditional bequest had provided. She made the choice anyway. She was 23 years old and she had a life to live. She chose it. The price was everything the will had attached to her compliance. Nobody wrote that story, not clearly, not completely. The press reported that she had relinquished her claim to the Astor fortune upon remarrying. That phrase makes it sound like grace, like a voluntary release. It was not voluntary. It was the automatic operation of a legal clause, drafted before the Titanic sailed, written by a man who died in April 1912 and governed his wife's life until March 1940. She did not release anything. The mechanism simply executed. I want to say something here, directly, because what I keep returning to, sifting through these records, looking at these numbers, is not the cruelty of the individual clause. It's the architecture of it. The will was designed so that Madeleine could have comfort or freedom, but not both. It made the question of whether she would ever love someone again into a financial negotiation with a dead man. And what strikes me is this: no one designed that architecture alone. A lawyer drafted it. Witnesses signed it. It was probated and executed without comment. The people who could have flagged the profound inequity between $69 million and a contingent $5 million trust, no one did. They recorded it. They filed it. And it sat in the public record for more than a century, completely available, rarely examined as what it was, the burial, encoded in a legal document. The first approach came before the body was even cold. In April 1912, the United States Senate convened a formal inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic. Witnesses were called. Testimony was taken. The inquiry's mandate was navigation, the ice warnings, the ship's speed, the chain of command that had allowed the Titanic to proceed full steam into a known ice field. But the testimony that entered the record was broader than that mandate. Archibald Gracie Roman IV, a first-class passenger and witness to the evacuation, provided specific testimony about the boarding of Lifeboat 4. He described how the women had been required to crawl through the promenade window because the boat had been lowered to A deck. He described Colonel Astor helping his wife through the window and asking Lightoller if he might accompany her. He described Lightoller's refusal. He described Astor stepping back. These details are in the Senate inquiry record. Anyone can read them. Madeleine's own account was captured through her spokesman and published in New York newspapers within days of her arrival home. She had been in the boat, had helped row and bail water through the dark hours on the Atlantic. She had watched the ship sink, and she had said something that, if you read it carefully, does not sound like the statement of someone in shock. It sounds like the statement of someone trying to understand a decision that had been made. She did not understand why the men had not seemed anxious to leave. The Senate inquiry noted the testimony. It did not pursue the question. The inquiry was interested in navigation, in radio procedures, in whether enough lifeboats had been carried, whether men of means, men like Colonel Astor, had made a voluntary decision to remain on deck, whether the culture of that ship, the culture of that class, had convinced wealthy first-class male passengers that the Titanic was not truly sinking right up until it was. That question was raised and set aside. The mythology arrived quickly and covered everything. Colonel Astor had placed his pregnant wife in a lifeboat. He had helped other passengers board. He had stood on the deck. He was a hero. The framing was so complete, so rapidly constructed, that Madeleine's quiet question, "Why weren't the men anxious to leave?" was absorbed into the legend before it could be heard as what it was. Her observation is still in the record. The inquiry is a public document. The second approach came in 1916, when Madeleine remarried. The press covered the remarriage. They reported that she had relinquished the Astor fortune. What they did not examine, what no outlet clearly articulated, was the specific equation. The 19-year-old widow of the richest man on the Titanic had been left a conditional trust that ceased the moment she tried to live her own life at 23. In exchange for marrying a banker, she lost the income from a $5 million trust and the use of two of the finest private residences in America. The conditional clause was a matter of public record. The will had been probated. The numbers were available. The mechanism was not hidden. It simply wasn't named for what it was, a legal instrument that attached a young woman's financial survival to her compliance with a dead man's preferences about her romantic life. No one published that equation in 1916. The third approach, the one that came closest, arrived in pieces across the year 1933. Madeleine and William Dick divorced in July 1933 in Reno, Nevada. The divorce was covered. 4 months later, on November 27, 1933, Madeleine married Enzo Firmont, a 26-year-old Italian boxer she had met on a cruise. She was 40 years old. He was 14 years her junior. The ceremony was a civil proceeding held in a New York City hospital room, because in September, the New York Times had published a small item headlined Mrs. Dick is injured. She was recovering from those injuries when she married him. A hospital room. A civil ceremony. November 1933. When reporters reached her son, John Jacob Astor VI, 21 years old, just beginning Harvard, having just inherited the $3 million trust his father's will had allocated to an unnamed unborn child, they asked whether it was true that his mother was marrying Firmont. He gave them a single sentence. "Unfortunately, it's true." That quote was published. It is still there, in the archive, in the contemporaneous press coverage. The son of the Titanic baby, the posthumous heir of Colonel Astor, speaking about his mother's third marriage in language that conveyed something beyond disapproval, something closer to grief, or resignation, or the specific exhaustion of watching someone you love make a decision you cannot stop. What the press did not examine, even then, was the accumulated pattern. This was not simply an unusual match. This was a woman who had now been inside and outside the Astor conditional will 3 times over, who had surrendered the trust income at 23 by remarrying, who had spent 15 years as Mrs. Dick and then lost that marriage too, who was now marrying a man her son publicly described as unfortunate, in a hospital room, under circumstances that suggested her life had narrowed considerably from the Fifth Avenue mansion where her son had been born. The pattern was visible in the archive, if you knew to look for it. Nobody looked. The fourth approach was the one that reached her most directly, and it came from inside the marriage itself. Madeleine divorced Fairmont on June 11, 1938, in West Palm Beach, Florida. The marriage had not been peaceful. Contemporary accounts document physical violence. She had, by sources available in the period, broken bones. She had fought her way out of a marriage that had become dangerous. She was 44 years old. She had survived the Titanic. She had survived the conditional will. She had survived 2 divorces. And then, after she escaped the marriage to Fairmont, Fairmont sold their story. He sold an account of their time together to the tabloid True Story, which ran it as a serialized exposé. Whatever had happened behind closed doors in the 5 years of their marriage was now available for public consumption. She had no power to stop it. She did not respond publicly. The articles ran. That same year, her mother died. The combination, the tabloid exposure, the grief, the solitude of her Palm Beach mansion, pushed Madeleine, by accounts in the period, into a sustained dependence on prescription drugs. She began taking them regularly. She retreated further. She was 44, then 45. She had been a public figure against her will for 27 years, and now she was being consumed by a press that had once covered her engagement and was now running a serialization sold by her ex-husband. The Carpathia had docked at Pier 54 on April 18, 1912. She had disembarked in shock, barely able to stand, her doctors ordering her not to speak about the disaster. She was still not speaking, 26 years later, not by choice, but because the terms of her life had never allowed for her own voice to be the authoritative one. She died on March 27, 1940, at her Palm Beach mansion. She was 46 years old. The official cause of death, a heart ailment. The qualifier, preserved in the Encyclopedia Titanica entry and noted by multiple historians, possibly after an overdose of prescription drugs. The official record says heart disease. The qualifier remains. If you've been watching this and you want to follow more stories like Madeleine's, where the documented record and the official version turn out to be telling 2 very different things, subscribe. There are more of them. More wills that buried more women. More archives that contain, if you read them in sequence, the shape of what was done. We keep digging. The burial almost held. For most of the 20th century, Madeleine Astor existed in the public memory as a footnote to a larger story. The Titanic story. The Astor fortune story. The story of a young woman who married above her station, was briefly the most famous widow in America, and then made a series of choices that cost her everything the Astor name had conditionally offered. That is the version the burial produced. Here is what survived it. The first surviving trace is the will itself. It is a matter of public record. It has been described, quoted, and analyzed in probate law publications, newspaper archives, and Titanic histories for more than a century. And what it shows, in sequence, is this: $85 million in total. $69 million to Vincent. $10 million in trust to Ava. $3 million in a placeholder provision for an unnamed unborn child. And Madeleine, $5 million in trust, $100,000 outright, use of 2 properties, all conditional on never remarrying. Anyone can read those numbers in order. The mathematics of the burial are not hidden. They are sitting in a probated legal document, accessible to anyone who searches them. The disparity between what the first family received and what the second wife received is not subtle. It does not require interpretation. It is there, in plain figures, expressing in dollar amounts what Colonel Astor believed each person in his life was worth. The second trace is the Senate inquiry. Archibald Gracie Roman IV testimony about Lifeboat 4 is in the public record. Madeleine's account, delivered through her spokesman and published in the New York Times on April 22, 1912, is in the archive. The specific detail, she thought there had been room for 15 more people in the boat. She did not understand why the men had not seemed anxious to leave. That question was entered into the historical record in April 1912. It has never been answered. The inquiry is a public document. The question is still in it, waiting. The third trace is the 40-year newspaper archive, beginning with the engagement announcement in August 1911 and ending with the death notice on March 28, 1940. The New York Times published more than 40 articles tracking Madeleine Astor's life. Read in sequence, they constitute a record of systematic reduction. The engagement, scandal, coverage, Madeleine's collapse from nervous strain. The Titanic, the widow, the pregnancy, the conditional will reported in outline. The birth, John Jacob Astor VI, born August 14, 1912, the Titanic baby. The emergence, photographs at Belmont Park in 1915. A return to society, carefully managed. The first remarriage, 1916, Mrs. Astor relinquishes claim to fortune. The mechanism unnamed. The second marriage dissolution, divorce, Reno, July 1933. The third marriage's announcement, Fairmont, the hospital room ceremony, November 1933. Her son's quote entered into the record. The injuries, Mrs. Dick is injured, September 1933. No follow-up. The divorce from Fairmont, West Palm Beach, June 1938. The death, Mrs. Fairmont dead in Florida, March 28, 1940. That arc, all of it, is accessible. Each piece is findable. What has not been widely done is reading those 40-plus articles as a connected document, a single record of what was done to one person across 3 decades. When you read them that way, the pattern does not require inference. It announces itself. The fourth trace is the lawsuit. When Vincent Astor died in February 1959, he left his half-brother John Jacob Astor VI nothing. Not an oversight. Not a lapse. A deliberate exclusion documented in Vincent's will, which did not name his half-brother as a beneficiary, nor, according to the legal record, had any prior version of Vincent's will. Vincent had never regarded Jakey as a legitimate Astor. He had, according to accounts that entered the historical record through the subsequent legal proceedings, questioned whether Jakey was even biologically Astor's son. The contemptuous nickname that circulated in the legal publications covering the case, rendering the Astor name as a crude insult, appears to have been Vincent's preferred private designation for his half-brother. Jakey sued. He alleged that Vincent had been mentally incompetent when executing his last will in June 1958, due to alcoholism. He alleged that Vincent's widow, Brooke Astor, had brought liquor to Vincent while he was hospitalized and used it to influence the will in her favor. He alleged, in essence, that the disinheritance was the product of impaired judgment and undue influence rather than coherent intent. The case was settled for $250,000. $250,000. Against an estate that, by 1959, had grown to figures measured in the tens of millions. Against the lifetime of exclusion that was the documented record of Vincent's relationship to his half-brother. Against the $3 million trust his father had left as a placeholder. Against everything the Astor fortune had accumulated since the Colonel's body was pulled from the Atlantic. $250,000. The settlement record is available. The petition excerpts are in the legal record. The legal publications that covered the case described the contested will's signing date as June 26, 1958. The argument that Vincent Astor's contempt for his half-brother was so thoroughgoing that it disinherited a man who was the documented posthumous son of the richest man on the Titanic is part of a public legal filing that was litigated and then settled. Closed for $250,000. Madeleine's son, the Titanic baby, shut out of the Astor fortune by the same family contempt that had greeted his mother at the door of Beechwood in 1911. The fifth trace is the one that requires the most patience to find, but is the most specific. In November 1933, Madeleine Astor married Enzo Fairmont in a civil ceremony in New York City. The ceremony was performed in a hospital room. She was recovering from injuries documented in the New York Times archive from September 14 of that year. She was 40 years old. The groom was 26. Her son had just described the marriage publicly as unfortunate. She was no longer Mrs. Astor. She had not been, in the full sense the conditional will intended, since 1916, when she remarried and the trust income stopped. She was not Mrs. Dick anymore, either. She was about to become Mrs. Fairmont. A civil ceremony. In a hospital room. While she was recovering from a documented injury 4 months after her second divorce, 4 months before her son inherited the placeholder trust his unborn self had been assigned in his father's will. This detail, the hospital room, is not in a court document. It is not in the will. It is in the newspaper record, cross-referenced across the reporting on her November 1933 marriage and the September 1933 injury item. It is the kind of detail that is visible only if you are reading the archive as a continuous document rather than a set of discrete events. It is a trace of what was left after everything the burial had removed. When I hold all of this together, the will, the conditional clause, the 40-year press record, the lawsuit settlement, the hospital room ceremony, the tabloid serialization, the death notice, what I see is not a series of misfortunes. What I see is the shape of a systematic reduction. Madeleine Force was 19 years old when she stepped off the Carpathia. The richest man in America was gone. The will was waiting. The family's contempt was waiting. The city that had refused to receive her was waiting. She could have the conditional trust, or she could have her own life. She chose her life. 3 times she chose it. And each time she did, something was taken: a home, an income, a name, a private marriage sold to a tabloid, a son excluded from a fortune by a half-brother who refused to recognize his existence. What could not be buried, what no suppression managed to erase, is the record of that reduction. It is in the will. It is in the Senate inquiry. It is in the archive. It is in the settlement record. It is in the numbers. The burial almost worked. The story of Madeleine Astor almost became exactly what the death notice made it: a married 3 times, divorced twice footnote to her husband's legend. But the record survived. And the record says something different. It says that a 19-year-old woman stepped off a rescue ship, 5 months pregnant, and faced an institution, a will, a family, a city's social order that had decided she was not fully real. And she spent 28 years being real anyway. Loudly, messily, at considerable cost, choosing her life over and over again even when the choosing cost her everything. The clearest trace, the one that points most directly at everything buried, is not a document. It is a juxtaposition. The will of John Jacob Astor Roman 4 gave Madeleine the income from a $5 million trust, the use of 2 mansions, 5 horses, and a luxury car, provided that she did not remarry. The death notice on March 28, 1940 called her Mrs. Fairmont, the name of the man she had been divorced from for 2 years. Between those 2 facts lies the entire arc. Everything the will tried to prevent, Madeleine did. Everything the family tried to contain, she refused to be contained by. She remarried. She remarried again. She chose her life with a determination that the institution found intolerable, and the institution made her pay for that determination at every stage. She gave up the mansion at 23. She chose it. She married again at 40 and watched her son's 3-word quote enter the public record. She chose it. She escaped a violent marriage at 44 and watched her privacy sold to a tabloid. She chose to keep going. She died at 46, in a house that was hers, under her own roof, with the name Dick, her second husband's name, the name she had taken back after the last divorce. Not Astor. Not Fairmont. Dick. She reached back and took a name that had been hers by choice, not by birth or by a dead man's conditional generosity. Mrs. Fairmont, dead in Florida. That is what they printed. Not the woman who asked, from a lifeboat in the North Atlantic, why the men had not seemed anxious to leave. Not the woman who chose her life over a fortune 3 times, when most people would have made a different calculation. Not the woman whose son was born 4 months after the Titanic sank, who grew up to inherit $3 million while his half-brother kept $69 million and refused to acknowledge his existence. Mrs. Fairmont, dead in Florida. The name of a man she had left 2 years before she died. The name the burial assigned her, even at the end. That headline is still in the New York Times archive. Anyone can find it. It is the last trace, and it tells you, if you know what you are looking at, exactly how thoroughly they tried to make her disappear, and exactly how imperfect the burial turned out to be, because the archive survived. The will survived. The inquiry survived. Her question, why weren't the men anxious to leave, survived. And what survived is enough.